Before we begin this powerful historical story, I want to connect with our audience. Drop a comment below and tell us, where are you watching from today? What city, what country, and what time is it where you are right now? Are you someone who's drawn to these untold stories of resistance and courage from our past? If these forgotten voices speak to you, hit that subscribe button because we bring you these buried truths every week. December 24th, 1859, Riverside Plantation, Mississippi Delta. The air thick with wood smoke and the promise of violence. Ruth. That was the name of the woman who had turned Christmas Eve into a funeral pyre for 9 men who thought they owned more than her labor. Ruth Magnolia Johnson, though they never called her by her full name, never acknowledged that she had chosen Magnolia for herself after the tree where her mother used to sing. 26 years old, hands scarred from cotton and kitchen fires, back striped from whips, but eyes that held something her masters never saw coming. They trained her to cook their meals, to tend their fires, to keep their house running smooth as butter. What they didn't know was that she was learning every corner of their routines, every weakness in their walls, every moment when they would be alone. The overseers had names. Thomas Hartwell, who liked to make the children watch when he whipped their mothers. Samuel Cross, who took more than labor from the women in the quarters. Benjamin Murphy, who counted every grain of rice and beat anyone who came up short. Marcus Webb, who burned Ruth's letters, the ones where she was teaching herself to write by copying Bible verses. James Clayton, who sold her son Moses downriver just to hurt her. Peter Daniels, who laughed when she begged to know where Moses had gone. Edward Stone, who made her cook the feast while her boy's empty bed grew cold. Henry Foster, who said she should be grateful they let her live after Moses ran away the first time. And Jacob Mitchell, who promised that Christmas Eve would be the night they taught all the slaves what happened to mothers who raised runners. This is the true story of Ruth, who learned that love could burn hotter than any flame she'd ever tended, and that sometimes justice comes not from above, but from the kitchen, where a woman has spent years perfecting the art of fire. Before we continue with the video, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The morning of Christmas Eve dawns gray and bitter, frost covering the Mississippi Delta like a shroud over the dead. Ruth stands at the kitchen window, watching the breath of the horses make white clouds in the stable yard. She has been awake since 3, as always, stoking the fires that keep the big house warm while the quarters stay cold. Her hands move automatically, kindling, paper, the careful arrangement of logs that will burn slow and steady. Fire has been her companion since childhood, more reliable than any person in her life. The kitchen smells of sage and brown sugar, of the ham she's been curing since October, of the sweet potatoes that will never make it to any slave's mouth. Ruth moves through her domain with the precision of 26 years' practice. Every pot, every pan, every knife has its place. Every flame, every temperature, every timing burned into her memory like brands on cattle. They think they own her skills, but Ruth knows something they don't. She's been studying them just as carefully as she studied the perfect heat for cornbread. Thomas Hartwell comes in first, tracking mud across her clean floors. Tall and soft around the middle, with hands that have never done real work but are quick with a whip. He expects his coffee, black and bitter, his eggs exactly 3 minutes in the boiling water, his bacon crispy but not burned. Ruth serves him without a word, without looking at his face, because she learned years ago that eye contact invites conversation, and conversation with Thomas Hartwell always ends with someone getting hurt. "Ruth," he says, and her name sounds like an insult in his mouth. "Master Pemberton wants a special dinner tonight. Christmas Eve feast for all the overseers. Ham, turkey, all the fixings. You understand?" She nods. She has been planning this meal for weeks, but not for the reasons they think. Samuel Cross arrives next, shaking snow from his coat, bringing with him the smell of tobacco and unwashed clothes, and something else that makes Ruth's stomach turn. He's younger than Hartwell, quick-tempered, with pale eyes that linger too long on the women in the quarters. Ruth sets his plate down harder than necessary, and he laughs. "Careful there, Ruth. Don't want to have an accident on Christmas Eve." But Ruth is thinking about accidents, has been thinking about them since the night they took Moses. About how easy it would be for someone to slip, to fall, to find themselves in the wrong place when fire decides to spread. The other overseers filter in throughout the morning. Benjamin Murphy with his ledger books and his way of making every meal feel like a theft. Marcus Webb with ink-stained fingers and a mouthful of scripture he uses like a weapon. James Clayton whistling some tune that makes Ruth want to break every dish in the kitchen. Each man comfortable in his cruelty, secure in his power, never imagining that the woman who serves their meals has been memorizing their patterns for months. Ruth remembers Moses. Not the way they want her to remember him, as property lost, a lesson about the price of running. She remembers his laugh when she taught him to read using Bible verses scratched in the dirt behind the quarters. She remembers how he used to help her carry water from the well, his small hands gripping the bucket handles. She remembers the morning she woke to find his bed empty and his shoes gone, and how her heart broke and swelled at the same time because her boy had chosen freedom, even knowing what it would cost. She remembers James Clayton bringing Moses back 3 days later, the boy's feet bloody, his spirit not yet broken, but bent. She remembers begging Master Pemberton, actually getting on her knees in the mud, asking him not to sell her child. She remembers Clayton's laugh when Pemberton agreed to let Moses stay, for now. She remembers the night 2 weeks later, when they came for Moses anyway. How Clayton held her back while the others dragged her screaming son toward the wagon. How Moses looked back at her once, and she saw in his eyes not fear but forgiveness, as if he understood that she had tried, that love sometimes isn't enough. She remembers the silence after the wagon wheels faded into darkness, how the quarters felt empty, even filled with people. How the other mothers looked at her with eyes that said, "Thank God it wasn't mine," and "I'm sorry," and "You should have hidden him better." Most of all, she remembers the promise she made that night, kneeling beside Moses' empty bed. Not to God, because God seemed busy elsewhere. Not to herself, because she had made herself too many promises already broken. She made the promise to the darkness, to the fire that had been her only constant companion, to the kitchen that had taught her that everything burns at the right temperature. The afternoon passes in preparation. Ruth's hands know this work so well she can let her mind wander to other things. She thinks about timing, about how long it takes bacon grease to catch flame, about which doors stick and which ones swing free, about the way men move when they're drunk on Christmas Eve, slow and confy, ident and careless. She thinks about the cellar where they store the wine with its one narrow entrance, about the dining room with its heavy curtains and wooden paneling, about the kitchen wing, connected to the main house but separated by a corridor that could be blocked, about 9 men who have never imagined that the woman who cooks their food might have reasons to cook them too. Peter Daniels stops by the kitchen near sunset, ostensibly to check on dinner preparations. Really, Ruth knows, to remind her of her place. He's the oldest of the overseers, been on Riverside Plantation since before Ruth was born. He knew her mother used to tell Ruth stories about how Mama was a good one, never caused trouble. "Your Mama would be ashamed," he says now, watching Ruth baste the ham, "raising a boy who thought he was too good for honest work." Ruth doesn't answer. She has learned that silence is sharper than any words, that letting men fill quiet spaces with their own voices often reveals more than they intended. Moses always was too smart for his own good, Daniels continues, reading and writing and putting ideas in the other children's heads. Some things are better left alone, Ruth. Some lessons need teaching before they spread. Ruth nods, as if she agrees, as if she hasn't spent the last 3 months learning everything she can about locks and keys and which windows face which directions. As if she hasn't been testing how quickly different materials catch fire, how much smoke different woods make, how to build a blaze that burns hot instead of high. "Master Pemberton's been good to you," Daniel says, "letting you stay in the big house kitchen instead of sending you to the fields after Moses ran. Don't make him regret his kindness." Kindness. Ruth tests the word in her mind like she tests the sharpness of her knives. Kindness that lets her cook their food while her son works some other master's fields. Kindness that gives her a warm kitchen while her people freeze in the quarters. Kindness that keeps her close so they can watch her break a little more each day. "Yes, sir," she says, because it's the answer that makes him leave fastest. Evening approaches with the weight of winter and the promise of snow. Ruth sets the dining room table with the plantation's best china, silverware polished until it gleams, crystal glasses that catch the lamplight like trapped flames. She arranges everything perfectly because she has been trained to perfection, because anything less than perfect invites punishment, and because tonight, perfection serves a purpose they will never see coming. The ham sits golden and gleaming on its platter, surrounded by roasted vegetables and fresh rolls that fill the house with the smell of celebration. The turkey rests beside it, skin crispy and dark, stuffed with Ruth's special dressing that took her years to perfect. Sweet potato casserole with a crust of brown sugar and pecans. Green beans cooked with ham hock until they're tender as silk. Cornbread made with real butter instead of the lard they usually allow her. Apple pie with a lattice crust that took her 3 attempts to master. It looks like love, this meal. It looks like the kind of feast that brings families together, that marks the holiest night of the Christian year, that celebrates abundance and gratitude and peace on earth. But Ruth knows that love and hate can use the same ingredients, that the difference isn't in the cooking, but in the intention behind it. She checks the fires throughout the house one more time. The kitchen fire burning steady and hot, the parlor fire reduced to glowing coals, the dining room fireplace freshly stoked, flames dancing behind the screen. The guest room fires banked but ready to flare with the right encouragement. Fire everywhere, waiting. The overseers begin arriving as darkness settles over the Mississippi Delta like a blanket thrown over a corpse. They come loud and jovial. Already half drunk from their private celebrations, tracking snow and mud through the house Ruth has spent the day preparing. They shed their coats and hats in the front hall, their voices echoing off the high ceilings, their laughter sharp in the winter air. Thomas Hartwell surveys the dining room with the satisfaction of a man who believes the world exists for his pleasure. The table groans under the weight of Ruth's preparations, every dish perfectly placed, every glass filled with wine that cost more than most slaves see in a year. The fire crackles in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls, warming the room until the men loosen their collars and roll up their sleeves. "Ruth outdid herself tonight," Samuel Cross declares, carving into the ham with strokes that seem too violent for the occasion. The meat falls away in perfect slices, pink and tender, glazed with honey and brown sugar and spices that Ruth ground by hand. Damn shame to waste cooking this good on Christmas. Should make her do this every week. They laugh as if the idea of working Ruth to death is the height of humor. As if she isn't standing in the kitchen doorway, listening to every word, her face a mask of servitude, while her heart beats with the rhythm of revenge. She has served these men for years, has listened to their conversations, has learned their weaknesses as thoroughly as she's learned their appetites. Benjamin Murphy talks with his mouth full, gravy running down his chin. "The new girl in the quarters, the one we got from the Williamson place, she's got potential. Young, strong, good teeth. Might be worth training for housework." "Too pretty for housework," Marcus Webb interjects, refilling his wineglass for the 3rd time. "That kind of pretty is better suited for other duties." More laughter. Ruth feels her hands clench into fists behind her back, feels the familiar rage that she has learned to swallow, to compress, to transform into something colder and more useful. They are talking about another mother's daughter, another family torn apart for their convenience, another girl who will learn what Ruth learned, that their bodies belong to anyone with enough power to take them. James Clayton wipes his mouth with a linen napkin, leaving stains that Ruth will never have to wash again. Speaking of training, we should talk about next year's crop rotation. I'm thinking we push them harder in the spring planting, make up for lost time after the Moses situation. The Moses situation. As if her son was weather, a natural disaster that disrupted their perfect plans. As if Moses wasn't a boy who carved wooden animals in his spare time, who asked Ruth every night to tell him stories about places where children learned to read in schools instead of hiding behind quarters. As if Moses wasn't the reason Ruth gets up every morning, the voice that whispers to her in the darkness, the memory that turns her love into something sharp enough to cut. Peter Daniels pushes back from the table, his vest straining against his belly. "Ruth, bring us more wine, and light the lamps in the parlor. We'll take our cigars and brandy in there." "Yes, sir," Ruth says, her voice steady as river stones. She moves through the house like a ghost, lighting lamps, feeding fires, preparing the parlor for 9 men who will never see another Christmas. The brandy decanter catches the lamplight, amber liquid that will slow their reflexes and cloud their judgment. The cigars sit in their cedar box, rolled tight and ready to burn. She serves them brandy in crystal snifters, the good glasses that Master Pemberton reserves for special occasions. Each man takes his portion with the carelessness of someone who has never wanted for anything, who has never counted the cost of luxury in other people's pain. They settle into leather chairs that creak under their weight, cigars glowing like small fire as in the darkness. Ruth retreats to the kitchen, but not to clean dishes or bank fires for the night. She moves with purpose now, gathering the tools she's been collecting for weeks. The key ring she lifted from Thomas Hartwell's coat pocket and copied, working by candlelight to file duplicates that turn in every lock in the house. The rope she's been braiding from kitchen twine, strong enough to bind a man's hands behind his back. The bottles of cooking wine she's been saving, the ones with the highest alcohol content, perfect for feeding flames that need encouragement to spread. She thinks about Moses as she works, about the boy who should be here helping her carry water and chop kindling and learn the skills that might have kept him alive in this world. She thinks about the stories she used to tell him, about places where people like them were free, where children went to school and families stayed together and no one owned anyone else. She thinks about how Moses used to ask if those places were real and how she always answered yes, even when she wasn't sure, because hope was the only gift she could give him. Now hope has transformed into something else entirely. Now hope has teeth and claws and the knowledge of exactly how much heat it takes to turn a house into a tomb. The clock on the kitchen wall chimes 11. Ruth checks her preparations one more time. The dining room doors locked from the outside, the key hidden where no one will think to look. The windows in the parlor nailed shut from the inside, the work done weeks ago and painted over so carefully that no one noticed. The corridor between the kitchen and the main house soaked with cooking oil, spread thin enough to look like spills, thick enough to catch flame and hold it. She can hear their voices through the walls, growing louder and more careless as the brandy works its way through their systems. Thomas Hartwell's braying laugh, Samuel Cross's slurred curses, Benjamin Murphy's drunken singing, the sounds of men who believe themselves untouchable, who have never imagined that Tuso, he woman who serves their food, might have reasons to poison their Christmas joy. Ruth lights a single candle, the flame dancing in the darkness like a prayer made visible. She holds it steady, watching the wax drip onto her fingers, feeling the small, sharp pain that reminds her she's alive, that reminds her why she's doing this. For Moses, who deserved better than a world that saw him as property. For her mother, who died with dreams of freedom still burning in her heart. For all the children in the quarters who go to sleep hungry while these men feast on the fruits of stolen labor. The candle flame grows brighter as Ruth carries it through the house, touching it to the oil-soaked wood, to the curtains she's been treating with kitchen grease for weeks, to the kindling she's been hiding in corners where shadows gather. Fire blooms wherever she touches it, spreading with the hunger of something that has been held back too long. She starts in the dining room, where the Christmas feast sits abandoned, plates half empty and wine glasses overturned. The tablecloth catches first, flames racing along the fine linen like water finding its level. The wooden paneling follows, old dry wood that burns with the sound of celebration, crackling and popping as it feeds the growing fire. Ruth watches for a moment, memorizing the sight of their precious dining room, transforming into something else, something cleaner. The flames spread to the parlor through the corridor Ruth has prepared, following the trail of oil like a bloodhound following a scent. She hears the first shouts of alarm, the confused voices of men who are just beginning to understand that their safe world has become dangerous. But the doors are locked, the windows sealed, the fire spreading faster than their alcohol-clouded minds can process. Thomas Hartwell's voice rises above the others, still trying to give order, is still believing that his authority extends to natural forces. "Ruth! Ruth, where are you? Open these doors!" But Ruth is in the kitchen, feeding the fire that races along the walls, watching the flames climb toward the ceiling like prayers ascending to heaven. She doesn't hurry. There is no need to hurry. She has planned this moment for months, has tested every variable, has imagined every possibility. The fire will do its work with or without her supervision. Samuel Cross is pounding on the parlor door now, his fists making sounds like thunder against the solid wood. The other men join him, their voices rising in panic as smoke begins to fill the room. But the doors are good oak, built to last, and the keys are safely hidden where dying men will never find them. Ruth lights another candle from the flames that dance around her, carrying fire from room to room like a benediction. The guest bedroom's upstairs, the study where Master Pemberton keeps his ledgers full of human transactions, the library with its books about the divine right of property owners. Everything burns with equal enthusiasm, fire making no distinction between guilty and innocent objects, consuming the symbols of oppression along with the men who wielded them. Benjamin Murphy has found an axe somewhere, is trying to break down the parlor door with blows that shake the house but don't break the wood. His breath comes in sharp gasps, panic and exertion, and smoke combining to steal the air from his lungs. Behind him, Marcus Webb has fallen to his knees, overcome by the thick smoke that pours through the room like fog made solid. Ruth stands in the kitchen doorway, watching her work consume the house around her. The fire has a life of its own now, feeding on 26 years of her accumulated rage, growing stronger with every beam it devours, every wall it reduces to ash. She thinks about Moses, about how he used to say that fire was the only thing that couldn't be owned, the only force that served no master. James Clayton has given up on the doors, is trying to break through the sealed windows with a poker from the fireplace. But Ruth nailed them shut with care, using techniques learned from watching carpenters repair storm damage. The glass cracks under his blows but doesn't give way, and the frames hold against his desperate efforts. The smoke is getting thicker now, filling the parlor until the men can barely see each other through the grey haze. Peter Daniels has collapsed into one of the leather chairs, his breathing shallow and labored, his face grey as old paper. Edward Stone crawls across the floor, searching for air that no longer exists, for escape routes that Ruth has carefully eliminated. Henry Foster still has strength enough to shout curses at the woman he assumes is somewhere in the burning house, threats and promises of punishment that ring hollow in a room full of dying men. But Ruth is beyond the reach of their authority now, protected by walls of flame, surrounded by the justice that fire brings to all things equally. Jacob Mitchell tries to organize the others, his voice cutting through the panic with military precision. "Form a line. We break through together, on my count." But there are only 6 men left standing, and their coordination fails as smoke steals their breath and fire steals their hope. Ruth remembers every name now, speaks them aloud like a prayer or a roll call of the damned. Thomas Hartwell, who made children watch their mothers bleed. Samuel Cross, who stole more than labor from women in the quarters. Benjamin Murphy, who counted grains of rice while people starved. Marcus Webb, who burned letters and called it righteousness. James Clayton, who sold Moses for the price of a horse. Peter Daniels, who called slavery kindness. Edward Stone, who made her cook while her heart broke. Henry Foster, who promised Christmas Eve would tear lessons. Jacob Mitchell, who planned to break spirits along with bodies. One for every tear she cried when Moses was taken. One for every night she dreamed of freedom. One for every scar on her back. Every humiliation she swallowed. Every moment she had to smile while they destroyed everything she loved. 9 men for 26 years of stolen life. 9 flames for a lifetime of serving those who saw her as less than human. The fire roars now like a living thing, consuming oxygen and wood and fabric with equal hunger. The parlor has become a furnace, the air itself burning, the temperature rising beyond what human flesh can endure. Ruth can hear the men's voices growing weaker, their movements more desperate, their breathing more labored. Thomas Hartwell makes one last attempt to reach the door, crawling across the floor with the determination of a man who refuses to believe he can die. But the smoke is too thick, the heat too intense, and he collapses with his hands stretched toward freedom he will never touch. Samuel Cross has stopped moving entirely, his body curled in the corner where he fell, overcome by smoke and heat and the terrible understanding that his victims have found a way to balance the scales. Benjamin Murphy lies beside the shattered window, glass in his hands, blood on his knuckles, his last breath escaping in a sigh that sounds almost like relief. Marcus Webb clutches his Bible to his chest, the leather binding beginning to smoke in the intense heat, the pages curling and browning at the edges. His lips move in what might be prayer or might be curses. Ruth cannot tell and does not care. The fire will judge his words along with his deeds. James Clayton has fallen silent, his body still, his hand reaching toward nothing. Peter Daniels follows soon after, the oldest overseer claimed by flames that make no distinction between age and youth, between experience and ignorance. Edward Stone and Henry Foster succumb together, their breathing stopping within moments of each other, as if death has come to collect them, in pairs. Jacob Mitchell is the last to fall, his military bearing maintained even as his body fails him. He dies with his back straight and his eyes open, staring into flames that reflect nothing back but the justice he spent his life denying others. Ruth watches until the voices stop, until the movement ceases, until the parlor becomes a tomb filled with smoke and silence. She has kept her promise to the darkness, to her son, to her mother's memory. She has balanced the scales with fire and fury, has given Moses the only justice this world seems capable of providing. The fire spreads beyond her control now, consuming the entire house with enthusiastic hunger. Ruth walks through the flames like a woman walking through a garden, protected by purpose and powered by righteousness. The kitchen burns around her, the tools of her trade melting and warping in the intense heat. The dining room where she served so many meals collapses in on itself, ceiling beams falling like the judgment of an angry god. She makes her way to the front door, stepping over debris and through smoke that should kill her, but somehow parts before her like a curtain. The cold winter air hits her face like a benediction, clean and sharp after the smoky tomb of the house. Behind her, Riverside Plantation burns like a candle lit for the dead, flames reaching toward stars that shine indifferent and eternal. The quarters are alive with activity, people running toward the fire with buckets that will prove useless against such an inferno. Ruth sees familiar faces in the orange light, women and men and children who understand what they are witnessing even if they cannot say it aloud. Freedom burning itself into existence, justice consuming injustice, fire writing the only verdict that matters in a language everyone can read. Some of them will whisper her name in the darkness, passing the story from youth to mouth like a secret gospel. Ruth, who cooked the Christmas Eve meal that 9 overseers would never finish eating. Ruth, who turned the big house into a funeral pyre for the men who sold her son. Ruth, who proved that fire serves no master, bows to no authority, recognizes no difference between the powerful and the powerless when the flames grow hot enough. Others will claim they saw nothing, heard nothing, know nothing about how the fire started or why the parlor doors were locked from the outside. They will protect her story with the same silence they use to protect their own survival, understanding that some truths are too dangerous to speak, but too important to forget. Master Pemberton arrives as the roof collapses, his carriage racing up the drive with horses wild-eyed from the smoke and heat. He jumps down before the wheels stop turning, running toward his burning house with the desperation of a man watching his wealth turn to ash. But there is nothing to save, nothing to salvage from the inferno that has consumed his property and his power in equal measure. Ruth stands in the shadows beyond the fire's light, watching him scream orders that no one follows, watching him realize that all his authority cannot command flames to retreat or dead men to rise. She feels no satisfaction in his anguish, no joy in his loss. Justice is not about happiness. It is about balance, about making the scales level even when the weight of truth breaks everything in the process. The constable arrives near dawn, his face grim in the grey light that filters through smoke and snow. He surveys the smoking ruins with the weary expression of a man who has seen too much violence, who understands that some fires burn for reasons deeper than accident or carelessness. The bodies in the parlor are beyond recognition, charred beyond the possibility of resurrection, reduced to ash and bone, and the terrible silence of the finally judged. They will write in their reports that the fire started in the kitchen, that Christmas Eve celebration became Christmas morning tragedy, that 9 good men died in a terrible accident. They will not mention the locked doors or the nailed windows, the oil-soaked corridors or the carefully planned timing. Some truths are too dangerous for official records, too threatening to the order that depends on believing that property cannot rebel, that the powerless cannot achieve power through fire and fury. But the people in the quarters will remember. They will tell their children and their children's children about Ruth, who loved her son enough to burn down the world that stole him. They will whisper her name like a prayer and a promise, like a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied, that fire burns hotter when it has been banked and tended and fed on years of accumulated rage. Ruth disappears into the winter dawn like smoke dissipating in the wind, walking north toward rumors of freedom, toward the underground railroad that carries people from bondage to possibility. Behind her, Riverside Plantation burns itself into memory. 9 crosses of ash marking the graves of men who learned too late that even the powerless can find power in the right tools, the right timing, the right combination of love and fury. Some say she made it to Canada, where former slaves build new lives with their own hands, and their children learn to read in schools instead of hiding behind quarters. Others claim she died in the snow between Mississippi and Memphis, her body never found, her story becoming legend. But whether Ruth lived or died, her Christmas Eve fire burns on in the imagination of everyone who has ever served those who despise them, who has ever smiled while being destroyed, who has ever dreamed of a world where fire makes the final judgment. The story spreads through the slave quarters of the Delta, like flames through dry wood, each telling, adding details and subtracting others until truth becomes myth, becomes inspiration. Ruth, who turned Christmas Eve into Judgment Day. Ruth, who cooked the last meal 9 overseers would ever eat. Ruth, who proved that love can burn hot enough to melt the chains that bind hearts as well as bodies. If this story haunts your dreams and warms your heart in equal measure, it is because justice is always both terrible and beautiful, because fire recognizes no distinction between guilty and innocent when the flames grow hungry enough. Some Christmas Eves are for celebration, for gathering around fires that warm rather than consume, for remembering the birth of hope in a world that needs salvation. But some Christmas Eves are for reckoning, for balancing scales that have been weighted toward injustice for too long, for proving that even the powerless can find ways to make the powerful pay. Subscribe and share this story with those who understand that history is written by survivors, that truth sometimes wears the face of vengeance, and that fire serves no master but burns with equal hunger through everything that claims dominion over what should be free.